All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Good morning. My name is Justin Mauger. I'm the Central and Eastern Washington Community Health Educator for the Washington Poison Center. Welcome to our sixth annual Overdose Awareness Series. We're glad to have you back. Quick housekeeping reminder, this series runs with new speakers and topics every Tuesday this month. We still have tickets available, so please don't hesitate to invite your colleagues, friends, family members, neighbors, anyone you think will appreciate the content of this series. Also, just briefly, thank you to our sponsors and partners. We work for Health Washington, the Washington Department of Health, Drug User Health Program, and Teen Health Hub, and the Washington State Healthcare Authority. This is our first year opening the series to sponsors, so we really do appreciate our early adopters. Additionally, as participants who are tuning in, you are muted, so please direct questions and comments to our chat box. Finally, if you want a certificate of attendance, you will need to take a survey that will be emailed to you from HUVA at the end of the series. With that, we are so happy to welcome Dr. Ati back to the Overdose series to help us learn about crowd control chemical agents. Where I live in Spokane, we've seen our law enforcement deploy chemical agents a couple of times so far this year, and as such, I think it's a particularly important topic, and I very much appreciate Dr. Ati giving us her time and expertise this morning. Dr. Suki Ati is an assistant professor at the University of Alabama and practices emergency medicine and medical toxicology. After her medical toxicology fellowship in Atlanta, Georgia, she moved to Birmingham, Alabama in 2020 to work at the University of Alabama at Birmingham's Emergency Medicine Residency and Medical Toxicology program. So with that, Dr. Ati, thank you so much for giving us your time and expertise today, and please take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Justin. Super excited to be here. This is definitely a very timely topic. I would love to hear your questions and input at the end. If there's any police officers or people who, deal with these sorts of chemicals daily in their work, I'd love to hear from you at the end. And please correct me if I'm wrong about anything, because while I know the toxicology side, I don't necessarily know everything about the police or law enforcement side. Okay. So I have no disclosures. So there's like a lot of stuff around the nomenclature of these chemicals. I'm just going to try to stick to crowd control chemicals or crowd control agents because, I don't really necessarily like the term riot control agents, and I'll get into more of that the next slide. But these are pretty scrutinized chemicals by the public, or the press and media. There are lots of incidents of worldwide civil unrest, and there have been a lot of reports of use of crowd control agents. And what is the goal of using them by law enforcement? Typically, the goal is to deter or disperse or temporarily render and incapacitate those people who are involved in protests or might be causing some sort of disturbance without using a more lethal method. There is also, like the psychological component of using them, where law enforcement will use them to sort of demoralize crowds at times and disperse a crowd, and they can, use a chemical instead of live ammunition and minimal physical intervention to, achieve that goal. These chemicals will produce rapid, non-lethal, incapacitating clinical effects. And that's typically through, the irritant effects of the chemicals. The time of onset is really quick, takes, onsets within a few seconds after exposure. The duration is meant to be very brief. Usually most victims are able to escape the area and get out of that contaminated atmosphere and get decontaminated to, minimize their contact with the chemical. And lastly, the goal of use of these chemicals is to maintain a high safety ratio where the ratio of the lethal dose to the effective dose is, not detrimental. So there's common umbrella terms or a moniker or common monikers for these chemicals, and one that really is used commonly is tear gas or riot control agents. Historically, the term for these agents was harassing agents, and other commonly used terms you might hear are like mace, pepper spray, lacrimators, crowd control agents. The name tear gas basically came into use because of the ocular irritation you get and the lacrimation these chemicals produce. That's where we get the term tear gas that's very commonly used in the press and by the public. But the word gas is somewhat of a misnomer. These chemicals are actually solids that are dissolved into solvent, like liquid solvents, and then aerosolized for use. Um, and a more specific term is probably lacrimators, because, that obviously implies that you're producing tears upon, mucosal membrane contact with your eyes. And also, I really like the term chemical irritants. This is basically an appropriate term because the exposed individuals are experiencing a really intense irritation of their mucous membranes and their skin. This is a chemical or a table that just has like the military designations that have been applied to the most commonly used crowd control agents. The military classification uses chemical divisions of C agents, and the most common agents are depicted here, and they include CN, which is chloracetophenone, CS, chlorobenzolidine, malonitrile, and then CR, which is dibenzoxazepine, and then oleoresin capsicum, which is commonly known as pepper spray. In reference to the physical states and solubility states of these chemicals, these chemicals are solids, like I said earlier. They're very insoluble in water, and therefore have really slow hydrolysis rates, and therefore they're pretty stable in storage. So they're kind of ideal to buy and store if you are a large law enforcement group. They have usually been mixed into some sort of solvent like methyl isobutyl ketone or tetrachloroethylene. There's usually propellants that are used to help propagate them and help aerosolize them. And that includes stuff like nitrogen, butane, propane, carbon dioxide, or halogenated hydrocarbons. And the common characteristic of them is their mechanism of action, which is mediated by TRPA1 and TRPV1 receptor agonism, which I'll get into on the next slide. And they all do the same thing, which is, a relatively or intended relatively brief irritation after exposure to sort of deter whoever's in the atmosphere to get out of that area and disperse. So the biological mechanism whereby these chemical control agents exert their effects is less well described than, say, for other weapons used in chemical warfare. I'm not saying that these are used in chemical warfare. They were once, but not currently, or shouldn't be. And so it's less described, but their effect does appear to be related to interaction with transient receptor protein ion channel family. The sub groups of this ion channel family is the TRV1 receptors, which are known as the vanilloid receptors, and the TRPA receptors, known as the transient receptor potential anchorin 1. Going back to the TRV1 receptors, these are, or both of them essentially are ion channels, and they play a really crucial role in sensation of pain and inflammation. They are activated by various stimuli. Typically, they do get activated by, high temperatures, like, really hot water, or, temps typically greater than 43 degrees Celsius. Acidic products, so, acids with a pH of less than 5.3. And also capsaicin, which is the agent we typically associate with oleoresin capsaicum. The activation of these receptors essentially triggers the downstream release of neurotransmitters like substance P, which go on to contribute to the sensation and inflammation, or the pain sensation that patients typically feel like in their mucous membranes around their face, on their skin. And that's because these receptors are located on the sensory nerves of the trigeminal, vagal, and dorsal root ganglia. Um, when stimulated, they do elicit a lot of pain in the eyes, the nose, and upper and lower respiratory tract and skin. And they do trigger sneezing, coughing, hypersecretion, and depending on your underlying physiology, you might have, bronchospasm, bronchoconstriction, triggering of asthma, etc. Um, oh, and I forgot to mention there is also blepharospasm that you'll experience with these agents. When you have contact with the eyes, your eyelids do spasm as well. Currently, the most commonly used crowd control agent is chlorobenzaldehyde malonitrile, so CS agent. It's replaced the once very commonly used agent chloroacetophenone, CN agent. This chloroacetophenone was used in World War I by multiple countries, including the US, Germany, some of the other European countries like France. It was used as sort of like a tear gas agent to help basically force people out of like the trenches or force soldiers out of the trenches and become exposed and leave their comrades behind or, basically, provide a clue as to where their comrades are to make, the whatever munitions they wanted to use more effective. And then it was eventually replaced in the late 1950s, 1960s by CS eventually. And CS was manufactured by two chemists, Corson and Stoughton. And that's where the military designation of CS comes from. It's essentially the namesake of these two scientists abbreviated as CS. Both or all of these essentially exist as like a white solid at room temperature. And because CS was actually less toxic than CN, it was eventually the agent that replaced chloroacetophenone in all over the world, including the US. The third compound that I've listed here is dibenzyl oxazepine. This was also in my table earlier. It's also pretty potent and less toxic than CN, and it is used around the world, but not as often as CS is. The other agent that's used a lot is oleoresin capsaicin, which is pepper spray, or OC. This is going to help me segue into mace, a pretty commonly used term for pepper spray. So in addition to the use of pepper spray in crowd control, the OC has been used in personal self-defense sprays, which you all know, or like bear sprays, etc. So the invention of this product mace was actually really transformative. What it did was that it took this crowd control agent that was meant to be sort of like a frontline like crowd control chemical for law enforcement to a more public or private use by civilians. So it essentially began as like a household invention. So these two scientists essentially, well, they weren't scientists. One was a scientist, he was an inventor, and his wife was a teacher. They were a young Pittsburgh couple. They apparently had a pet alligator as well in their basement in Pittsburgh, which I thought was really strange. But I guess they're eccentric people with interesting ideas. And what happened is one of Doris Littman's colleagues, who is the wife of Alan Littman, the couple that came up with Mace, she was a teacher, and one of her colleagues was mugged on the streets of Pittsburgh. And she brought the story home and told her husband, Alan. And the two of them kind of started talking about how, what kind of tools a woman might use in self-defense that was, readily accessible and would really deter like a perpetrator really quickly. And so what they did was they decided that they would make like an aerosol spray can of some sort of chemical to that would deter like someone that might that a woman might use in self-defense. They tried stuff like kerosene, freon, sulfuric acid, and some other harsh irritants, but they ended up settling on chloracetophenone. I don't know where they got it from or how they got it. I mean, I'm sure it's pretty easy to get. I mean, you can get anything. I mean, they didn't have the internet, but today you can probably get anything on the internet. So they settled on chloracetophenone, and they made the reason why it was like so marketable is that uh, the way they had designed the product was that it made they had like made the bottle easily able to propel the chemical compared to like other stuff that was already out on the market. And they were able to patent the method of how they packaged it and how they were able to propel it. And they named it chemical mace. Um, and the reason why they called it chemical mace is that, they figured that this could produce the same incapacitating effect as like a medieval mace, so like a spiked club, but without the physical force. And he ended up sending off, Alan Lippman ended up sending off patent applications for the spray can and nozzle and the chemical mixture, and ended up getting like paid $100,000 to buy this patent, or was paid $100,000 for this patent by a company who ended up continuing. I think it was bought by another. It's not the same company today, but eventually the chloracetophenone was replaced by CS, and then currently what's used is the OC, which is the oleoresin capsicum. Because obviously CS and CN are less toxic. CN, or the chloracetophenone, can cause burns and like blindness and blistering because it is an alkylator, compared to the CS and OC. So that's one of the main reasons why a lot of people or a lot of countries don't even really use it anymore. So on a broad scale, looking at history of use of these chemicals, the first recorded use of chloracetophenone was in Paris. There were the Paris riots and labor riots in 1912. There's another agent that was used during those riots, which was ethyl bromoacetate by the police. And then these agents were then soon after, that was in 1912, 1915, used in World War I. And apparently tear gas was used even before the use of chlorine at the Battle of Ypres. So it was actually like the first, the crowd control agent, chloracetophenone, was the first chemical warfare agent used in World War I. I came across this really sort of fun quote by Amos Alfred Fries, who was a general in the U.S. Army. He was the second chief of the Army's Chemical Warfare Service that was established during World War I in response to the use of chemical warfare that had started. The quote states, "It's easier for man to maintain morale in the face of bullets than in the presence of an invisible gas." So this just speaks to how irritating these chemicals really can be, and how, what the intent was behind their use. They were used to force people out from behind barricades and trenches and tunnels, because, especially in an enclosed space, there's really severe burning of the eyes and skin and tearing and gagging. So soldiers would inevitably like flee from, the effects of the agents, and then leave their, basically show their cover, and then basically, sell out their comrades by running out of the environment. I mean, obviously they were not doing that intentionally. And then based on that, the enemy would be able to attack with more precision. So World War I was sort of like the Wild Wild West in chemical warfare. Many different chemicals were used. I've read so many numbers, like 30 to like 50 different chemicals were used throughout that war. Things included chemicals like acrolein or bromoacetone, bromobenzyl cyanide, chloroacetone, and also the chemical diphenylamminochloroarsine, which is particularly interesting because it's an arsenic-based compound. and was developed for use specifically during World War I. It's militarily classified as a vomiting agent, and it also has some like irritant properties. Chlorpicrin was another one that was used very commonly. It was used both as an irritant and a lethal chemical during World War I. Today, it's still used, but not for crowd control purposes, but for additive purposes to chemicals that don't have any sort of order and that can be life-threatening. So things like sulfuryl fluoride, which is a structural fumigant. I found this really cool picture on Wiki Commons, and it's a picture of the U.S. Army, where where they used to use, or I think they might still do this, where they might use tear gas, specifically CS gas, in training facilities. And these facilities were known as gas chambers, and they would, put the soldiers in these environments, start the let the gas in, and then make them practice vital skills to survive out in the field. So they would practice putting on like their masks, etc., let each other know there's a gas in the air, that kind of thing. So this picture is pretty cool, and it shows how this sort of practice or training was done. So World War I left quite the aftermath in morality, and the League of Nations really wanted to prevent inhuman conduct during warfare, whatever that means, and they drafted the Geneva Convention because hundreds and thousands of soldiers had died from use of chemicals in World War I, and just the asphyxiation and effects of the chemicals were so awful and inhumane that they wanted to prevent this from ever happening again. So the US was supportive of this, but was not a signatory and did not ratify until 1975. And at the time of this convention, the USA really did not recognize crowd control agents as chemical warfare agents. In World War II, the German military, as you all know, did develop very strong chemical agents, or lethal chemical agents, I should say, called nerve agents. They were accidentally discovered through production of or looking for new pesticides to use in agriculture. And they, for some reason, held a lot of restraint and did not use them, despite having used, carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide gases in their gas chambers during that time. So, there was another World War after, and there was not use of these very lethal chemicals around. During the Vietnam War, however, before the US ratified the Geneva Protocol, the US did use a lot of riot control agents or crowd control agents, specifically CS, very extensively. They were used to kind of like smoke out Vietnamese soldiers again from like Viet Cong tunnels, and even smoke out civilians. And you also know, I'm sure many of you know, that the defoliant Agent Orange was used, which is a herbicidal. And the use of these chemicals did lead to widespread protests here in the US. And then there was subsequent use of crowd control agents here too in those protests. So what was happening there was also happening here. And this is just I don't know if you guys have ever looked at older articles in the New York Times. They take you like online, they'll take you to like an old-timey like library reader to look at these articles. And I did find some really cool articles for this talk. And this is just like one article about the chemicals that were used. And they're just describing in this article what a typical soldier might be doing in preparation for, using some of those chemicals. So just interesting. So during this time, President Ford was in power, and towards the end of the war in Vietnam, President Ford signed an executive order. The term flies around a lot these days. It was Executive Order 11850, which unilaterally renounced use of crowd control agents in armed conflict. But there were some exceptions listed in this executive order, and examples of exceptions include stuff like, controlling rioting prisoners of war, or areas out, the president could authorize use of these chemicals outside in like an immediate combat zone to protect like their convoys, essentially, etc. The last time I was giving a talk, we did briefly talk about the Chemical Weapons Convention. So the Geneva Convention eventually led to the development of the Chemical Weapons Convention. What does it do? It fills in the gaps of the Geneva Convention. So this is like the latest, world treaty that's called the Convention on Prohibition of Development, Production, Stockpiling, and Use of Chemical Weapons. Short is Chemical Weapons Convention. So it's essentially an international arms treaty. It was approved by the United Nations General Assembly in 1992. It was ratified by the US in 1997, and it took force worldwide in 1997 as well. So what does it do? Well, the Geneva Convention didn't really talk about, stockpiling or despite like not being allowed to use them in warfare. The Geneva Convention didn't say anything about like, stockpiling or acquiring or, making these chemicals just in case. So this is what the Chemical Weapons Convention sort of, bridges that gap, and does not, and mentions that, you, in addition to not being able to use these chemicals in warfare, you're not allowed to make them or stockpile them either. And whether that is followed by everyone, as you will see on the next slide, around the country, despite having ratified this treaty, may not be true, but the OPCW has gone around to every country that's ratified this convention and helped help countries rid of their chemical munitions like nerve agents and other chemical weapons. So Russia has ratified the Chemical Weapons Convention, and they signed that treaty on January 13th, 1993. And they ratified it on November 5th, 1997. Despite this, Russia has been accused of using chemical warfare in Ukraine recently. One of the ones that was in headlines was chlorpicrin. And again, it was used to help expel Ukrainian soldiers from like hiding places, etc. So sort of like, gassing, tunnels or trenches to get them out and, make them a more likely target. So the last time, I think, yeah, a year ago, I gave this talk, people had questions about whether chemical or crowd control agents were mentioned in the Chemical Weapons Convention, and whether they were prohibited for use in the Chemical Weapons Convention. Well, they're not allowed for use in warfare. So, CN, CS, OC, these chemicals are not allowed to be used in warfare, but they very specifically in the Chemical Weapons Convention state that riot control agent use is permitted for law enforcement, including domestic riot control purposes. So, while you can't do this, in a war, you can use it domestically through law enforcement. International humanitarian law says something similar, that, that riot control agents are a prohibited method of warfare if you don't want to violate international humanitarian law, but it does not apply to domestic use. Something I was really curious about and couldn't really find a great answer to, hopefully someone in the crowd might know more than me who actually deals with this stuff daily. I'm not sure when police really decide to pull the trigger, or law enforcement decides to pull the trigger on using crowd control agents. What I kind of found looking around for this is that there's sort of like a continuum of force that's used when anytime there's like a perceived threat. So it's kind of like a pyramid there. It might start with just having officers in the area, just having an officer in the area, usually most of the time, I've read something like 80 to 90% of the time, really deters a lot of, violence or disruption, or any sort of crime. If that doesn't work, they might use verbal commands or cooperative controls. They might use empty hand submission techniques thereafter if, things are escalating. And then eventually we'll go to, less lethal methods or intermediate weapons, which would be crowd control agents. And if that's not working, then lethal force is used. Less lethal weapons also include things like projectiles or kinetic bullets, etc. So, it's not just the chemicals that, this refers to here. So you can see why, it can be kind of variable when these agents are pulled out to use. It really is based on perceived threat. And, it could be for anything like, getting some suspect out of their house and, the house is barricaded. So they, deploy some sort of agent into the house to get them out versus, trying to control a large crowd. Methods of delivery of these agents could be an entire lecture on its own. I have 2 very brief slides on this stuff, but reiterating again, the stuff is not really gas. It's rather aerosolization of solid particles that have been dissolved in some sort of solvent. Usually the particles are being deployed in canisters that are typically flung by hand or fired from some sort of launcher. And these devices will have stuff like, CS or CN mixed in with a pyrotechnic mixture. So they're incendiary devices. So when detonated, there's like creation of smoke or fog. And, in addition to disseminating that particle or the particles of the chemical, they're acting like a smoke or fog disseminator and creating like a screen. So essentially, incendiary devices are very common and typically used, and the composition of what's in that pyrotechnic blend in these devices will vary amongst manufacturers. There's also a delivery of these agents as pepper balls. So there's pepper balls there on the left. They're deployed similarly to paintballs, if you've ever been paintballing. And the chemical agents released upon the ball breaking an impact. They can also be deployed using vehicles or aircraft or drone-mounted systems. Pepper spray is stored in pressurized containers and can be released as like a stream. And pepper spray can also, or so OC can also be deployed in projectiles that are thrown by hand or launching device, so stuff like hand grenades, etc. So what makes people sick from these chemicals when they're not supposed to be very injurious, right? I mean, you do get a lot of reports of injuries from from use of these chemicals. So there's a lot going on, right? So these chemicals have the intended effect of hysteria, unpredictability. Stampedes occur. Stampedes are deadly. I mean, if you have a bunch of people running in a direction or crisscrossing each other, people are definitely going to fall and run over each other, and you can get pretty severe crush injuries from stampedes. I've been in a stampede situation. I was in Italy watching like a football match in like this square, and like someone let off like a firecracker and someone else thought it was like a gun, or people just started thinking it was like a gun or a bomb, and it just was hysteria. Like I could see like the wave of people moving, like trying to get out. Like there was this wave of human bodies moving in this like really crowded like town square. It was really crazy, and then people just started running, and there was a lot of injuries, and I think it actually got written up because it was like 2,000 people got injured, and I can't believe I escaped not getting injured. Anyway, so there's also within these crowd control agent dispersion events or methods, there's other stuff that's being deployed by law enforcement, right? There might be kinetic projectiles, stun grenades, rubber bullets. And protesters also bring their own paraphernalia. They bring bear spray. There's reports of protesters bringing Molotov cocktails or their own projectiles. So, you never, things are just kind of like all over the place, and, everyone's kind of firing stuff. We give the law enforcement a lot of bad rep, but they also get a lot of, injury from this kind of stuff. So what's the treatment for exposure to these antidotes? The primary treatment is removal from exposure. I mean, that's like most things in toxicology. You want to remove the patient from the exposure. That includes getting them out of their contaminated clothing and putting that stuff into things like airtight bags. Because there's a lot of secondary exposure because this stuff is like thick aerosolized solid stuff, right? And it's going to really sit on like porous material and doesn't hydrolyze very easily. It's not very water soluble. It's not going to be really easy to wash off or anything like that. So skin irrigation with copious cold water and soap is the most recommended thing to use. You can also consider using something called a reactive skin decontamination lotion. It has been studied as a potential tool for decontamination of CNCS or capsaicin. So it's basically a kit that has like a sponge with a lotion that has potassium butadiene monoxide, and that basically binds the toxins and helps degrade it. It works pretty well for CS, not as well for CN or the OC. And all personnel that are involved in decontamination should really consider protecting themselves as well, because there's a big risk of secondary contamination. So you might want to, if you're in EMS or responding to these areas, you really want to consider having at least a face shield or goggles. You can wear a chemical resistant suit, nitrile gloves, etc. You can go as far as getting a respirator with chemical cartridges designed to filter out these chemicals. RCTs have looked at the efficacy of using things like, milk or antacids or baby shampoo and water from, or using these things to decontaminate themselves from these chemicals. But the RCTs have shown no benefit to using them. There's like a number of them, but here's one. And you'll see sometimes like on the news and stuff, like people in the crowds running around with like gallons of like milk. Apparently they don't work, milk doesn't work that well. So sticking to water is like a good idea. The eyes are really important to pay attention to in decon, especially because you can get really bad corneal burns and scarring, blindness, depending on like how close you are to the chemical and how much you're exposed to. It is rare to get blindness, but there are definitely reports in the literature. And also tons of people, if you look back to the George Floyd protests, a lot of people lost their vision through kinetic projectiles. So, paying attention to the eyes, taking out what are they called? Contact lenses. Taking out contact lenses if you're wearing them and exposed to these chemicals is really important. And then using, rinsing your eyes for a long time. And you can use litmus paper testing to see, alkalization of the eye. Symptomatic treatments like topical ophthalmic anesthetics can be used, for eye pain. You can use nebulized bronchodilators for those who might be, have, reactive airway diseases like asthma, etc., or emphysema, COPD. So, there really is no like antidote, but there is, supportive care that's typically deployed, including things like humidified oxygen, etc. Given that it's really hard to, decontaminate people, the best thing is just to get into some cold water, some soap, rinse your eyes with water as well to get the stuff off of you and keep all your stuff, your clothing, etc., in a sealed bag. That's the gist of this. There are some things that studies have kind of looked at other than water and soap, which include diphenterine, which is a hypertonic chelating agent. It's amphoteric. It's shown to decrease pain levels and allows, apparently, per some studies in Europe, a faster recovery time. So you would prophylactically, in these studies, patients prophylactically wear it and then are exposed to the crowd control agent and then had decreased pain levels compared to those who are not treated. There's also studies on using those transient receptor potential channels as targets for countermeasures. So antagonists of the transient receptor potential channels could be a future agent that we could use to prevent, the effects of these agents. What is the health impact of chemical irritants? We actually don't really know. Um, they're obviously designed to disperse crowds with a really short-term physical discomfort. But if you look at the data and research that's been done, a lot of it's very limited from, mid 20th century. A lot of it's on animals, rats, etc., or healthy young men in the military. And the data has been basically extrapolated as safe for a general population. And now if you look at a protest crowd, there's people there from, all walks of life, right? There's children, there's, adolescents, there's, older people, there's middle-aged people, and, as a lot of people with underlying health conditions. So obviously those can be exacerbated on exposure to these chemicals. So if you have underlying, heart failure or COPD, you might not be able to, tolerate the adrenaline from an event like this, not be able to get away from the environment and get more sick, or you might have, onset of reactive airway stuff. So that's just something to keep in mind, when you're told that these chemicals don't really, do much. I'd say in the broad stroke, yeah, like they're technically probably safer than a lot of things, but we have to consider demographics of these protests and the environment and temperatures, etc. So I'm not trying to gaslight here, but I found these like really funny studies. They're kind of old-timey. I think they're from like, oh, the 70s, it looks like. And they basically wanted to see if personality and mental, mindset could determine your tolerance to crowd control agents, particularly CS that was used in these studies. So they basically, exposed people to CS and had them take personality scores, etc. And they found that those who were physically less tolerant to the crowd control agent CS um, they were found to be characterized by this personality test that, they had greater use of denial, repression, somatic complaints, and more tolerant groups. Uh, and, like there's just like this innate thing about you that, you probably just are not going to tolerate this kind of stuff very well. Compared to other people. And then they also found that, more anxious people were less tolerant of the effects. I mean, this kind of stuff kind of makes sense, but it's also like victim blaming. Like you're just more anxious. And then apparently in the second study here on the side, they gave diazepam versus not to people who were exposed to the agents. And then obviously the people with diazepam were able to tolerate them a little bit better, I think. Again, not gaslighting, but obviously if you give people diazepam or some benzos before putting them in the presence of a bunch of crowd control agents, they're probably going to be a little bit more relaxed. Anyway, so there's very minimal epidemiological studies of the health impact of these chemicals. So we don't really know much. A lot of the stuff we know is from retrospective data collection, and obviously there's a lot of problematic things with using retrospective data collection or survey use, etc. But the largest pool of data we have is this study by Har et al., where they did a systematic literature review and assembled a really large data pool by doing that. And they looked at a bunch of papers and studies between 1990 and 2015 all over the world. So they end up getting 31 studies from 11 countries. And they found that within their systematic review, they found 9,261 total injuries and classified 74.3% of them as being minor or like transient symptoms. So stuff that might be, that you just expect from chemical irritants, like, lacrimation, mucosal irritation, etc., coughing, that kind of thing. And then they said 17% of these, greater than 9,000 injuries were defined as a moderate. And this is stuff that was defined as unexpected effects based on what we know about chemical irritants and like what, stuff that you wouldn't really expect from being exposed to them. and they were, visible on physical exam or lasted longer, may or may not require management by a health professional. And then 8.7% of these injuries were severe, and they were defined as those that necessitated professional medical management. And of these people, of the very severe injuries, 2 died, and 1.3% had permanent disability. And permanent disabilities were defined as globe ruptures, blindness, TBIs, or traumatic brain injuries, limb amputations, functional loss of limbs, persistent psychiatric problems, and persistent respiratory conditions. So, I mean, looking at this, which was a systematic review, looks is still kind of, the data kind of points to, most of the time exposure to the stuff is really not going to cause severe health problems unless you really have underlying stuff going on. So, going back to historical, or wanting to talk about one of the most historical protests in the U.S. is the protests that were ignited by the death of George Floyd while in police custody. That was in May 2020 in Minnesota. This led to really large protests to date, or to the largest protests to date in the U.S. and actually around the world as well. There was like worldwide demonstrations against racial inequity and there was a lot of crowd control use, or crowd control less lethal weapon use during that time. So a lot of kinetic projectiles or pepper balls, etc., and chemicals that were used. And this retrospective study looked at hospitals in 2 medical systems in Minnesota. I do believe these hospitals were in Minneapolis. And they basically went through medical charts of patients that showed up to the hospital after exposure to these agents and tried to essentially find what kinds of injuries were common and or bodily injury was common, and classified them in this paper. There was a lot of blunt injury, right? Obviously, a lot of these chemicals are in gas canisters that are thrown or projected. There was a lot of bodily injury. I mean, this is all stuff that's kind of like a byproduct of the use of these chemicals, right? Like, a lot of hysteria. There's also other things being used, like other munitions that are less lethal are also being used in causing these injuries. And then they classified the injuries of these patients. So there were, I think they included 89 patients during this medical search based on their inclusion criteria. And most of them had like mild injuries, and very few, only 4% had severe injuries, and total 7 patients required surgery. I don't know if you guys also remember from these protests, like a lot of people like lost something like 8 patients, I think, or 8 people in Minnesota alone lost vision or lost function of one eye from being hit in the eye by something. So anyway, pretty benign. They're not included in this study. I mean, the limitation here is just like 2 hospitals, but there are many other hospitals that were treating patients. So Portland actually during the George Floyd protests had the longest stretch of protests. They had something like greater than like 100 daily nights of protests during the George Floyd protests. And so there was like a lot of exposure to tear gas or crowd control agents. And there was a lot of associated healthcare utilization from the general population. And so a study was conducted using an anonymous cross-sectional web-based survey. And they asked people to participate who'd been to the protests. And they were kind of looking for a bunch of different things. But one of the things that kind of sets the study apart is that they looked for delayed effects. And because we don't really know much about that. And there was like some endocrine stuff that was noted, like a lot of women reported having menstrual changes. So almost half of the people who potentially menstruate reported having some sort of change in their menstrual cycle. There's a lot of GI effects that were persistent and psychological effects. I mean, delayed effects they're classifying as 1 to 2 days after exposure, but I think a lot of these people had these effects even longer than that, especially the menstrual cycles that were mentioned. There's been other historical protests around the world, you know, Hong Kong, South Korea, Beirut had in Lebanon had a really big protest recently from impending economic collapse. And if you look at all the papers from those, if you look at the papers from all of those uh, protests, if they've been written up or whatnot, you'll notice that, the people that got most sick were, people that got exposed in confined spaces, enclosed basements and stuff like that, or like in the subway and something's thrown down there, or they're injured through traumatic or use of like uh, other non-lethal methods like, using kinetic projectiles that are rubber bullets and all that. A lot of the injuries reported are traumatic and not necessarily from the chemical. And the people that do get sick from the chemical in those reports, you'll see are older or have some sort of underlying medical condition. There's also like autopsy studies out there where they've looked at people who've died from exposure to these chemicals, and there's really no like specific finding that everybody has. Like it just really, some people might have like really bad upper airway effects and swelling and obstruction, or some people might have really bad like pulmonary edema, et cetera, from being exposed to the chemical for too long and probably in an enclosed space, et cetera, and leading to a death. So overall, we probably don't know the overall health impact. Deployment technologies really vary. There's a lot of inadvertent injury from release of these chemicals. There's a lot of, health impacts typically do arise more when people are in warmer, humid temperatures or in confined spaces, and these are released. And we just don't have the availability of good data. We don't have, these studies have a lot of limitations. A lot of them are retrospective, survey, and a lot of patients or a lot of people at these protests don't want to participate in these surveys, et cetera, because they're afraid they're going to get, incriminated or, put in jail or something from being at this civil disturbance, et cetera. So it's hard to really collect this data. And we also don't have like any sort of registry or anything to sort of like follow this kind of stuff. I found this like article from like 1969 is referring to an outbreak, the Northern Ireland uh, riots that was like political and sectarian. And they used a lot of crowd control agents in this event. It was like, I think 4 days in 1969. And this article appeared in the New York Times at the time. And they were shockingly stating that chemicals could in fact, or these crowd control chemicals could in fact really, cause lung pathology and cause, bronchoconstriction, asthma flares, et cetera. They're not as safe as they're touted to be. So I just thought it was like a funny article, and how it made its way into the New York Times. Has anyone been to the MoMA in New York City? This is like, I'm almost done, so like my second last slide. It's like one of my favorite museums, but the first time I went there, there's this really cool exhibition there by this artist, Ralph Borland. I feel he had like this suit on display, something he'd created, and I think the suit could be like a really provocative like Black Mirror episode, or it could be like it could be part of a really bad or a really interesting Black Mirror episode. So it's from definitely one of my favorite exhibitions I've seen there. This was called Suited for Subversion. And what it is essentially is a protester suit prototype. It's basically like a civil disobedience suit that's designed to be worn by street protesters. So the cushion of the suit would protect you from physical force from police. But it's more than a shield. It draws attention to the risks that protesters face when defending their convictions in these protests. So in this design, there's like a wireless video camera that's mounted over the head that records, law enforcement action or protest actions in real time, and then it's uploaded in real time because it's a wireless system. It goes to a control station, so you don't have to worry about, finding the videotape after losing the camera. And then there's a speaker in the center of the chest here, and it amplifies the wearer's heartbeat. And then I quote from the MoMA exhibition. During a group protest, increasing heart rates would be audible as tension and excitement mounted in the crowd, creating a natural soundtrack. At the same time, the audible heartbeat would expose the vulnerability. Sorry, let me just say it again. At the same time, the audible heartbeat would expose the vulnerability of the individual. The fragility of the human body is exploited as a tool, a shield, almost a weapon against police munitions. So imagine like a crowd where you can hear everyone's heartbeat, increasing in intensity and rate. And if you could hear that echoing, and how would that change the protest? I just like love this. Lastly, I mean, there's ongoing global unrest. If you spend even 5 minutes on Instagram, I'm sure you could learn about 10 different protests going on in the world. They're pretty commonplace. And, most recently in the US, we're seeing protests against ICE in the USA. And governments and law enforcement groups are readily purchasing these agents for use, and we'll probably keep seeing the use of these agents. And, both the public at these events and law enforcement are at risk of injury. You have to really keep that in mind. So, they're important in the history of our world and in progression of our species. They're not going away, and neither will these agents. So it's good to be prepared. Thanks for having me. Any questions or anything?
Thank you, Dr. Ati. Yes, we do have a couple questions here. The first one is, can I find more about this anywhere? Like, do you have any resources you'd recommend for people to use or directions to pursue?
Oh, honestly, there's so many like good media articles out there. Like NPR has good articles, The Atlantic has good articles. If you have access to like a university library, you can find some really good summaries and reviews on them. I can also send some articles to Justin and Alex, and maybe they can email them out that I think are good reviews if you want to learn more. Um, there's actually like this really good free like military book online that I came across that has like the history of these agents and the history of government use and goes into a lot of detail. So I got a lot of my research from that book. So I can also send a link to that if you want to read more. But yeah.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. We'd be happy to help disperse that. I'll also just put my email in the chat here in case people want to follow up with me to get those. Okay, another question. I think some of these were answered in your presentation, but maybe revisit them. There's kind of three parts to this question. I know at least two of them were answered, but are there common antidotes to these chemicals? What antidotes can we get online? And I think this is really interesting. Can antidotes be dispersed like the chemical agents themselves to counteract or weaken them in the air?
That's for you and Jeff Bezos to solve. I'm joking. Okay. No, but yeah, there's definitely like there are studies looking at like, the transient receptor potential antagonism. So I had put up like screen caps of some of those studies. I mean, there is like maybe antidotes on the horizon, but I mean, I really doubt that they'll ever be like cheap or easy to get as like a civilian. But yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. We had another one in the chat. What is the expected duration of irritation? Do you recommend people to let the effects of the chemical run its course if they don't have access to eye wash?
Oh, what was the last part? If they don't have, oh, let the effects of the chem. Oh, yeah. I mean, you do your best. It's, this stuff just kind of requires copious irrigation. There's really not much more you can do that. It can be especially hard with like the eyes because you have like blepharospasm and, um, you know, sometimes, medical professionals will use stuff like Morgan lenses. It's hard to get those in. You might need like a numbing agent to help you tolerate like decontamination. So, you do your best. It really depends on like how long you're in the environment, what the environment's like, and how much you're exposed to, right? Like what the concentration is. And if you're ever really curious about what you got exposed to, you can use the Freedom of Information Act allows you to find that information out from your local law enforcement groups.
Excellent. And people can also call the Poison Center if they get an exposure, right?
Yes, yes. Wait, plug for the Poison Center. Call us. We can always help you out. Depending on like what your symptoms are or whatever, you might need maybe something more nuanced, and we can help you out.
Excellent. And I just put our 800 poison helpline in the chat.
Yeah.
It's 800-222-1222. It's the same no matter where you are in the country. You'll get connected to the closest poison center when you call that number. I had one final question. Um, and you may have covered this. I'm, oftentimes busy on the back end of these things and miss little pieces, but I hopefully it wasn't too obvious. What what pre-existing conditions make chemical crowd dispersed agents more of a risk to a person? Like, is there something like if I have this diagnosis or that diagnosis, and I notice that, I mean, I hope that, if you notice the dispersion of these agents, you're probably going to get out of there as fast as you can anyway. But is there anything that is, particularly increases a person's risk to an adverse event?
Yeah, I guess you kind of already alluded to something. Like if you have if there's protesters who are disabled, not able to get out of the environment very quickly, I mean, they're at higher risk. Children are, because this is very dense stuff, it settles closer to the ground. And children are small, they have, high minute ventilation rates and they breathe faster, so they're more likely to inhale more, especially if they're like in more enclosed space. If you have underlying lung conditions or cardiac conditions, you might be really influenced by exposure to this stuff. So, um, asthma is one that really comes to mind. Um, there's even like one study that said exposure, like one-time exposure to these agents increased risk for respiratory viruses later on, like that within that same season. I'm not sure, how accurate that, if that's always accurate, or I don't really remember all the details of the study, but I just thought that was interesting too.
Well, thank you so much. This was fascinating as usual. We've gotten to expect this now of excellent presentations from you. I think last year's was one of our highlights, and this was outstanding as well. So thank you so much. Just a reminder for the people watching, our next session is at 11:45. We have addressing lead poisoning in resource-limited areas of Washington State, and then also poisonous and hallucinogenic mushrooms of the Pacific Northwest. You get to pick which one you go to. Either of them are going to be absolutely fascinating. And of course, just go to the agenda on Hula and click on the link, and you should be able to watch them. Dr. Ati, thank you again so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.